Iniziamo con la parte del professor Michael Denton, the empirical challenge to the pan-adattational assumption, upon which the darwinian worldview is based. Quindi la sfida empirica all'assunto pan-adattazionista, che sarebbe funzionalista, adesso ci spiegherà, sul quale la visione del mondo darwinistica è basata. Ok, professor Denton.
So, the first slide is the title of my talk, The Empirical Challenge to the Pan-Adaptational Assumption, or Functionalist Assumption upon which the Darwinian worldview is based. My aim in this presentation is to show that the pan-adaptational assumption upon which the Darwinian worldview is based, namely that all or most character traits of living organisms are or once were adaptive and evolved to serve some function or functional end or purpose. I believe this is undermined by a vast body of empirical evidence. In essence, this talk is therefore about Thomas Huxley's ugly fact, in this case the existence of what would appear to be a vast amount of non-adaptive order in the biological domain, which fells a beautiful theory or worldview. Okay, slide 3. Darwin states his commitment to pan-adaptationalism in the introduction of The Origin, where he claims that adaptation is the primary phenomena that any evolution theory must explain. And in a later passage he makes the following unproven assertion: we may conclude that the structure of every living creature either now is or was formerly of some direct or indirect use to its possessor. I have always found this one of the most entirely unsubstantiated claims in the history of science. So, just to clarify here at The Origin, pan-adaptationalism is the claim that the primary organizing principle of life is adaptation, that all or the great majority of the order of a living organism is there to serve some function, just as the eye serves the function of seeing and the bacterial flagellum the function of bacterial motion. Note in the talk ahead I will often use the term functionalism instead of the more clumsy term pan-adaptationalism. It's important to clarify at the outset that I am not claiming that biological systems do not exhibit adaptations, nor have parts that serve functions. Far from it. I do acknowledge, as any biologist must, that adaptations do indeed permeate the whole realm of biology, from the beaks of the Galapagos finches to the streamlined shape of a dolphin or fish to the stinging cells of a jellyfish, the active site of an enzyme. But what I will claim is that alongside adaptive order, non-adaptive order which appears to serve no particular function, i.e. patterns without apparent purpose, is everywhere in the biological domain. Biologists since Aristotle have always seen adaptations to permeate the biological domain, but my claim here is not to deny adaptation, but to argue that adaptation is not the only organizing principle in biology, that there are causes beyond selection. Turning to the historical roots of functionalism, the notion that all features of living things are there to serve some adaptive purpose has a long history in English-speaking biology. It is very apparent that John Ray, the 17th century naturalist and one of the founders of Anglophone biology, was a firm believer in pan-adaptationalism. This is obvious even on the most cursory reading of his celebrated text, The Wisdom of God Revealed in the Works of Creation. In that book we read in a section which echoes Darwin's pan-adaptationalism, the body of man may thence be proved to be the effect of wisdom, because there is nothing in it deficient, nothing superfluous, nothing but hath its end and use. And about the eye, he comments, we shall find this structure and mechanism of the eye and every part thereof so well fitted and adapted as not the least curiosity can be added. And in one part of the book he makes the extraordinary claim, one of the most extreme in the history of pan-adaptationalism, that even male nipples have a biological function, even if it is difficult to cite what that function is. And he cites a Danish man who is able to breastfeed his babies when his wife's milk production failed. William Paley, an 18th century cleric with a deep interest in biology, was another supporter of functionalism. In his classic, Paley draws an analogy between living things and machines. He sees the basic order of an organism to be analogous to that of a watch, where every part serves some adaptive function, spring, escapement, gear chain, etc., which are all fashioned to function together to serve the function of the whole. Despite the current Darwinian consensus, however, a minority of biologists have never accepted the functionalist assumption. And this minority has included some of the leading biologists for the 19th and 20th century. In the 19th century, these included Geoffrey Saint-Hilaire, Theodore Schwann, Richard Owen, in the early 20th century, William Bateson, who coined the term genetics, and of course Darcy Wentworth Thompson in his great classic On the Growth of Form. George Mivart, a 19th century critic of Darwin, claimed that Owen spread abroad in England the perception that a deep significance underlies the structure of animals, a significance for which no mere practical utility can account. Homologies or ground plans for which neither hereditary nor utility can account reveal themselves in the limbs of chelonians, birds, beasts, and most noticeably in those of man. Some very prominent recent biologists who have rejected pan-adaptationalism include Stuart Kauffman, Stuart Newman, Brian Goodwin, and even Stephen Jay Gould. For the record, critics of functionalism who argue that causal factors beyond selection are responsible for a great deal of biological order are often termed structuralists. Stephen Jay Gould, past professor of paleontology at Harvard, has recently been perhaps the most prominent, recent, and very well-known critic of pan-adaptationalism. He writes in his great magisterial final publication, The Structure of Evolutionary Theory, about being embarrassed by the fervour of the adaptational convictions he held early in his career. Finally, if I could wipe out any of my publications off the face of the earth and out of all memory, I would gladly nominate my unfortunately rather popular review article on evolutionary paleontology and the science of form, a ringing paean to selectionist absolutism, buttressed by the idea that one could prove pan-adaptationalism even for fossils, which could not be run through the hoops of actual experiment. And he refers in another passage to adaptive explanations as being in certain instances no more than Rudyard Kipling type just so stories. Kipling was a famous Anglo-Indian writer. Evolutionary biology has been severely hampered by a speculative Stein of argument that records anatomy and ecology and then tries to construct historical or adaptive explanations for why this bone looked like that or why this creature lived here. These speculations have been charitably called scenarios. They are often more contemptuously and rightly labelled stories or just so stories if they rely on the fallacious assumption that everything exists for a purpose. Now I would like to briefly describe my own journey to skepticism regarding functionalism, which began while studying the development of the red blood cell at King's College London in the glory days just after the discovery of the double helix. The critical X-ray diffraction patterns which will reveal the shape of DNA were, of course, as most people know, done at King's College by Rosalind Franklin. So, the development of the red cell commences with a hematopoietic stem cell which undergoes a number of cell divisions leading to a proerythroblast and erythroblast and finally to the enucleate red blood cell. The remarkable process involves the ejection of the nucleus from the final erythroblast. It struck me that providing an adaptive explanation for the ejection of the nucleus, unique to mammals, poses Herculean problems. How could the loss of the nucleus have occurred gradually in small adaptive steps? A nucleus is either inside or outside a cell. But in addition, birds keep their nucleus, yet have a higher metabolic rate, that is, an oxygen need, than mammals. So the question was raised in my mind, is the loss, this extraordinarily complex process, really adaptive? Okay, the fact that fetal erythroid cells have a large nucleus when the demand for oxygen is critical further challenges the notion that the loss of the nucleus was to serve some adaptive end. The variable sizes of red cells in different mammalian species poses further questions and has never been given an adaptive explanation. Why should a horse and a cat have smaller red cells than a dog? In sum, many unique features of the biology of the development and final form of the mammalian red cell, which carries out one of the most important physiological functions on Earth, cannot be given a satisfactory explanation in terms of pan-adaptationalism. Now, turning to the botanical realm, What we find here is abstract patterns, apparently non-adaptive patterns everywhere. Yeah. Leaf forms are very complex, but again the forms appear to serve no functional end. It's the same with the textures of barks, the overall form of trees, pollen forms, and flower forms similarly appear to be abstract patterns which serve no specific functions. Indeed, there is almost every conceivable variety of floral pattern in terms of number of sepals, petals, stamens, and carpels. Moreover, the number of petals in different species often conforms to the Fibonacci series, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, 34. And the spiral arrangements of the scales in pine cones and the florets in sunflowers also conform to the Fibonacci series. As Darcy Thompson commented, the Fibonacci series stares us in the face of the fir cone. It does so for mathematical reasons, and its supposed usefulness and the hypothesis of its introduction into plant structure through natural selection are matters which deserve no place in the plain study of botanical phenomena. Another botanical process which poses a profound challenge to pan-adaptationalism is the development of the angiosperm egg sac and subsequent double fertilization. The number of divisions and cytological series of changes are simply baroque. The mature egg sac contains 3 cells, the antipodial cells, with no apparent adaptive purpose. One of the most extraordinary events in all biology is the double fertilization of the egg sac by 2 haploid sperm nuclei. One sperm nucleus fertilizes the egg cell, which then develops into the embryo, and the other fuses with the 2 haploid cells in the center of the egg sac to form a trisomic cell, which develops into the endosperm, which provides nutrition to the developing embryo. Just what tiny adaptive steps could have led to the trisomy of the endosperm? The entire phenomenon of double fertilization is completely enigmatic. Turning now to the microbial, to the unicellular domain. Again, abstract, apparently non-adaptive patterns are everywhere. The extraordinarily diverse morphologies of the tests or skeletons of different microorganisms convey the immediate impression of serving no particular function or adaptive end. Consider the various diatom and radiolarian tests shown in slides. Now let's see slides 36 and 37, 38, 39, and 40. These are surely some of the most complex morphological forms in all nature, and seemingly serving no adaptive purpose that we can imagine. Now I want to turn to another phenomenon, the apparently non-adaptive character of the unique ground plans or bough plans or taxa defining characteristics of the taxa in the Systema Natura, noting their invariance and abstract, often numerical, apparently non-adaptive character. The slide shows the form of the angiosperm flower ground plan, consisting of rings of sepals, petals, stamens, and carpels, conserved invariant in all flowers for 100 million years. What conceivable adaptive end did the flower ground plan serve? Again, what functions did the insect ground plan serve? Invariant for 300 million years in all insects, consisting of 3 body segments, 2 pairs of wings, 3 thoracic segments, 6 legs, 5 segments to each leg, 1 pair of antennae, 4 mouth segments, 8 to 10 abdominal segments. As shown on this slide, the insect ground plan is modified to serve a vast diversity of adaptive ends. The same is true of the ground plan of the insect limb. All insect limbs consist of no more than 5 basic parts: a coxa, trochanter, femur, tibia, tarsus. But as can be seen in the figure, different insects have limbs adapted for many different functions, while the underlying ground plan remains unchanged. What purpose did the 5 segments serve in the ancestral insect? Why do all 6 legs adhere to the same plan? Again, the insect mouth consists of the same unchanging ground plan, consisting of 4 components in all insect species. Now let us turn to the ground plan of some of the insect suborders. In the case of the dragonflies, all species have antennae formed of 3 to 7 joints. 3 ocelli, 2 large compound eyes, wings, 2 equal or sub-equal pairs, unfolded, richly veined, with 6 typical longitudinal veins all present. Abdomen with 10 complete segments in shape and narrow. Mid-gut without ceca. No one has ever identified the adaptive ends which caused the evolution of this unique set of character traits. And now we go to slide 51. All Hymenoptera, bees, wasps, ants and sawflies have 4 wings and hind limbs held together by small hooks, and the hind wings are smaller than the forewings. The females generally have an ovipositor, which may be modified for sawing, piercing or stinging. All species undergo complete metamorphosis. One of the subgroups of the Hymenoptera, the Apocrita, bees, wasps and ants, have the first segment of the abdomen incorporated into the thorax. A narrow region called the petiole joins this to the abdominal segment to become attached, which is called the gaster. Again, what functional end caused the first abdominal segment to become attached to the thorax? Why not some other means of generating the wasp waist? Again, in the case of the ants, one of the subgroups within the Apocrita all possess elbowed antennae, which are less clearly elbowed in the males. What environment constraint caused the elbow form to evolve? And now we go to slide 55. William Bateson, who coined the word genetics and who was a critic of functionalism, made the very apt comment. Would it be expected that the longer corn Prionidae, most of which have the unusual number of 12 antennary joints, did, as they separated from another longer corns which have 11 joints, gradually first acquire a new joint as a rudiment which in successive generations increased? If anyone will try to apply such a view to hundreds of like examples in arthropods of difference in number of joints and appendages of near allies, he will find that by this supposition of continuity of variation, he is led into endless absurdity. And he concludes, it is scarcely necessary to point out that these facts give no support to the view that the exactness or perfection with which the proportions of the normal form are approached is a consequence of selection. Homologous numerology is not limited to the insects or the pentadactyl limb. In the case of cephalopods, for instance, the octopus have 8 tentacles, while the squids have 10, 2 of which are considerably longer than the other 8. Again, octopus and squid have 2 gills, while other cephalopods, including the nautilus, have 4. The echinoderms, starfish and sand dollars exhibit a pentamerous symmetry. Among the Cnidaria, the jellyfish and sea anemones and corals, there is a great variety of intriguing radial symmetries. Among the Scyphodia, the jellyfishes, most exhibit a fourfold symmetry, having their parts symmetrically repeated around their oral arboreal axis to the number 4 or multiples of 4. Among the Anthozoa, the sea anemones and related pulpoid forms, different classes are differentiated by different types of radial symmetries and being classified on number and arrangement of tentacles and mesenteries and number and arrangement of septa. One colonial subclass possesses 8 pinnate tentacles forming a marginal circle of on the oral disc, 8 mesenteries attached to the gullet. The 8 symmetrically arranged tentacles and mesenteries give the pulp what seems to be an 8-fold radial symmetry. Another class are subdivided into a variety of groups exhibiting complex 6-fold symmetries and mesenteries in cycles of 6, 12 or multiples of 6. The textbooks of invertebrate zoology are full of innumerable additional examples. To claim that all these invariant patterns originated to serve some environmental constraint is without the slightest empirical support. This slide shows a page from one of the great structuralist classics by Richard Owen on the nature of limbs. Considering the ground plan of the tetrapod limb, Owen argued that no mere practical utility can account for homologies for which neither heredity nor utility can account. Several reveal themselves in the limbs of turtles, birds, beasts, and most notably those of man. As shown in the slide, the ground plan of the tetrapod limb is the same in the fore and hind limb. But how could selection for a forelimb arrive at exactly the same pattern as that in a hind limb? This, as Owen argued, is simply impossible given that the adaptive forms of fore and hind limbs seen in the hand and foot of man are never the same in any species. The conserved pattern of 7 cervical vertebrae in nearly all mammalian species, including the giraffe, poses again the same basic question. What functional end does the restriction to 7 cervical vertebrae serve? Okay, now although this presentation is basically focused on the apparent existence of a vast amount of non-adaptive order in living organisms, it is worth a short digression to consider briefly the challenge posed by the existence of unique taxa-defining novelties to Darwinism, highlighted by leading cladistic taxonomists between 1970 to 1990. During the period 1970 to the 1990s, there were cladistic skeptics at both the Natural History Museum in South Kensington and the American Museum of Natural History, who stressed that because each group possesses unique defining attributes or ground plans, cladistic classification shows that different groups are always and only related to each other as sister groups, that there are no empirically known ancestor-descendant sequences in nature. Image on the left is of the Natural History Museum in London, on the right the American Museum of Natural History in New York. Colin Patterson commented, re-cladism. As the theory of cladistics has developed, it has been realized that more and more of the evolutionary framework is inessential and may be dropped. Much of today's explanation of nature in terms of neo-Darwinism or the synthetic theory may be empty rhetoric. As far as ancestors are concerned, they exist not in nature, but in the mind of the taxonomist as abstractions, and yet they are discussed as if they have some reality. Although there are certainly many adaptive traits which define particular taxa, feathers, hair, many defining traits which underlie the taxonomic hierarchy, the ground plan of the flower, the pentadactyl limb, the elbowed antennae of ants and so forth, would appear to be in many cases non-adaptive. Yep, that's the end of this section.
Oh.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay.